your Lord. Now recall I said something about a fusion of style and content. The content is beautiful, and it's part of a passage in which the signs of the Lord have been mentioned, the struggle has been mentioned, and then the messenger is being told, declare the greatness only of your Lord. What's interesting is the phrase, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, is a palindrome. In other words, it spells backwards and forwards the same way. So the Quran is declaring the greatness of the Lord in a way, in its spelling form, and this is multiple instances in the spoken Quran, that it's actually a linguistic palindrome. Now, when you want to generate a palindrome in English, like race car, or Bob, or dad, or something like that, small one-syllable ones are easy to generate. Maybe a big word is a little harder, but a sentence, it would take you some time to sit down with words that are spelled backwards and forwards and come up with something that, and then even if you do that, your concern isn't your content. What's your concern? The spelling. So the spelling is actually dictating your content. Here you have multiple instances in the Quran where the content hasn't been altered. The content is continued, it flows with the passage, and yet the spelling structure is, it's a palindrome. It's symmetrical, backwards and forwards the same way. And this is not one, these are multiple instances in the Quran, and this is one area of the many areas of the linguistic marvel of the Quran. The only other thing I want to comment that's easily understandable, actually two things. One, from a historical point of view. In the 1600s, I believe this was a professor of the Catholic Church, had written a paper about the great error in the Quran, the great historical error in the Quran. And that refers to, the Pharaoh and Moses. Well, Pharaoh in the Quran tells one of his ministers, whose name is Haman, okay, he tells him to build him a tower, so he may reach the God of Moses and, to discuss with him. Now, this occurs about 4 or 5 times in the Quran. Haman is mentioned a total of 6 times in the Quran. When Christian and Jewish scholarship came into contact with this passage, the criticism was, first of all, there's no Haman mentioned in the Bible in association with the Pharaoh. Second of all, he has been mentioned in the book of Esther under the king Xerxes, in the story of the Tower of Babylon. The Tower of Babel, the famous story. And this is 1,000 years after Moses. So it's a completely different historical era where Haman, and that man Haman has been mentioned as building a tower. So the obvious alleged error was that Muhammad, ma'adallah, may have confused these stories that he was kind of getting from the Christians and Jews and kind of mixed them together and presented this. And this has been something that's been reiterated in Jewish Studies Encyclopedia.
All right, well, let me break in on here. And I am not an expert in this, so it's hard for me to comment on the specific, but that there is allegation that the Quran is bits and pieces of different Gnostic and different other religious literature that was out there at the time.
Yeah, there's no evidence to it. And the coherence of the Quran, the cohesion of it as a text, is the ultimate proof to the contrary. But just on that historicity point, Maurice Bucquois, it's about 70 years ago that he engaged in this study. He said, well, Jewish history contradicts what the Quran is saying about Haman and this tower building. Mm-hmm. Let's look at Egyptology. Let's look at Egyptian history. Mm-hmm. Because the French and the Germans at the late part of the 1800s had already started translating or getting into Egyptian hieroglyphics and reformulating the language to try to translate some of the ancient Egyptian texts. Egyptology was a big deal in the early 1900s even. So he travels to speak to some of these Egyptologists, says to them the Quran has this name, Haman, as a minister working for the historical Pharaoh at the time of Moses, that specific Pharaoh. The Egyptologists tell him, and this is actually articulated in his book, The Bible, Quran, and Science, that there's no way this man could have known that name, and it's not even going to be there because that language, the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, was already dead for a couple of thousand years. Nobody knew that language. Mm-hmm. After translation, he goes to Austria and finds out there's actually a list of people that worked in the court of Pharaoh. They find Haman as the chief architect. That's actually found in Egyptology, a name mentioned in the Quran. So from the historical point of view, last comment on this issue of the miraculous nature of the Quran claims, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr. We are the ones who have revealed the ultimate reminder.
We meaning?
God himself. He speaks of himself in the royal. Okay. And he says we've made the Quran easy for remembrance. We've made the Quran easy for remembrance. This is a statement occurred multiple times in the Quran. To this day, the only book that, to my knowledge, that is memorized by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people of all ages, despite their language background, by the letter, from one end of the book to the other, is the Quran without photographic memory. I don't have photographic memory. I just started learning Arabic in 2000. I've already memorized half the Quran. And this is part-time endeavor. You know, in Chicagoland, probably you'd find a couple of hundred kids that have easily memorized the entire Quran. In China, you'll find kids that have memorized, adults that have memorized Quran. So the fact that the Quran says that it's miraculously easy to memorize, a 600-page document, miraculously easy to memorize, and it's memorized by people from all over the world to the letter, in and of itself is a miracle.
We're going to have to get together again. They're signaling that we are out of time. Frank, thank
Definitely
you.
need more time on these topics.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for being with us, Frank. Thank you, Brother Norman Khan. And I'd like to thank you for sitting tight to another episode of The Deen Show. As you can see, we can sit with our brothers in humanity and discuss some of these topics in a civil way, and we can agree to disagree, or one day that brother that you're sitting with might acknowledge that there's only one God, and he agrees to worship the Creator alone without any associates, and that Muhammad is the last and final messenger. So with that said, we hope to see you again next time on The Deen Show. Until then, assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Allah